Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for joining us, and it's really gratifying to see you from so many diverse areas in the world. My name is Joanne Longton and I'm the IET Community Manager for the Project Controls Technical Network. I've popped my details on the screen right now, so please do get in touch with me if you're interested in learning more about the network or you just want to get more involved. We're always looking for new volunteers to get involved with the committee, and we do have vacancies each year, so please feel free to drop me a line on that email address. And also, if you have any ideas for future events or webinars, I'm very happy to receive your suggestions. So again, you can please email those directly to me. As I said, today's webinar is brought to you by the Project Controls Network, and this network is a collaboration between the IET and the ACOSD, who both have the joint aim of advancing the knowledge and understanding of project controls to as wide an audience as possible. Before we get started on the webinar itself today, I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a widget bar that has buttons that you can open simply by clicking on and then closing by minimizing. A couple of buttons I'd like to highlight. There's a Q&A button, obviously. Please enter your questions for our speaker today by typing them into that box at any time during the presentation. When the presentation's finished, we will answer as many questions as we have time for. If you don't see the Q&A box, just click on the button and that will bring it up. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, submit the problem also to us in the Q&A box and we'll get some immediate help to you. If the slides are not moving during the presentation, you'll need to refresh your screen, and you can do this either by pressing F5 for Windows or Command R on a Mac. If you have a slow connection, you might need to do this more regularly. And just the other button I just want to point out is the CPD certificate, which is being referred to on screen right now. That will be available after the webinar has finished for you. So in terms of my housekeeping, I think that will be it. I'd just like to introduce our speaker for today. So Dave Purton started his career and graduated with a Bachelor of Science Honours in Industrial Engineering, and he's worked in a number of roles in manufacturing companies, mostly in product development, project teams, or leading projects. In later roles, since 2000, Dave's roles have mostly been in project management in major automotive companies or the NHS. Dave retired from the NHS back in June of last year. Amongst other things, Dave is also chair of the IET Project Controls Network and has been so for several years. So I think that's enough from me now. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David. So thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm going to take a structured approach to look at each section and subsection of the PID and talk about what should and should not be included and why. The PID that I'm using is based on the Prince2 method. Prince2 talks about the principles, themes and processes, but the manual doesn't really provide the detail required to write a good PID. However, the business case section of the PID, I'm not going to base that on Prince2, but instead on the Treasury's Green Book, but more of that when I come to it. So the sections of the PID. The PID is made up of a number of sections, the first three being what I call the housekeeping sections. So there's a title page, there's the document control, and also a table of contents. The main body of the PID then follows, and that includes a definition, what is to be done, a section on how it will be done, the business case describes why it will be done, and then the project governance, how the doing will be controlled. The PID serves two purposes, the authorization to proceed and commit resources, and then as a benchmark to measure progress during and success upon completion of the project. So I'll talk about each of these sections in turn. The title page is a source of useful information. It not only conveys the name of the project, which needs to concisely state what the project will achieve, but also the key personnel, such as the SRO, Senior Responsible Officer, Management Lead, Project Manager, and if appropriate, There could be a technical lead or a finance lead. So the next section is document control. The PID is one of the key project documents. It needs to be a controlled document. This means that when it's amended, a version history is maintained to ensure everyone is working off the same iteration. The first section is simply a statement of the purpose of the PID, and this is a generic piece of text that doesn't change and will often be in an organisation's PID template. That's followed by a revision history. This is how version control is maintained. Most organisations will have a standard method that should be followed. Often this can be found in a policy for writing policies. All PIDs should go through a quality assurance review, and this is captured in the document here, recording who reviewed it, any comments they made, on what date and which version they reviewed. Then there's a space to record the authorizations, and it may require more than just the SRO, for example, financial approval, possibly even customer approval or regulatory approval. Each approval is recorded with a role, a name, and approval date. Where official copies are emailed out to people, for example, these will be uncontrolled copies, but a distribution list can be included in this section so that the team knows who to issue updated approved copies to in the future. Finally, in this housekeeping section, you can list abbreviations or acronyms. It's still worth spelling out the acronym in the document itself on first use and then put it in brackets. Then follows a table of contents. Most PIDs will be written in Word and distributed as PDFs. I would recommend inserting the table of contents towards the end of completing the draft so you're not constantly looking at the page numbers and updating them. If you do it via a Word table of contents, it inserts hyperlinks automatically, which facilitates quick access to sections by the reader. Don't forget also you should put page numbers in your footer, and I prefer to use a page of pages format. So if we get into the project definition and the PID proper, the first section is the background. And this is a section where a lot of PIDs go horribly wrong. They go into far too much depth and often start to cover what should be in the other sections later in the PID. So keep it as concise as possible to describe the history and the context. And in this case, it's the operational context rather than the strategic context, as that's dealt with in the business case. The background should not cover what is to be done, why or how. That comes later. More than a page is probably too much. Remember, there's a reader that you do need to keep engaged. The next section of project definition is the objectives and outcomes. And obviously this is a key section. You may include a vision statement or a view of the future state you wish to see. You should always work top down. That is, derive the future state from the vision. The project outcomes would then be derived from the vision, and the project outputs will be derived from the outcomes. That way you ensure that the vision, the outcomes and the outputs are all aligned. An output must be something that will enable an outcome. The outcomes together must deliver the vision. The outcomes and outputs need to be smart. They need to be specific enough to know when something has been delivered, i.e. not described in vague terms. They also need to be measurable. This may be as simple as saying, yes, a document has been created, or it could be relative, as in a wasteful activity has been reduced by 10% on average, or an actual measure, for example, 100k has been saved in a year. They do, of course, need to be achievable. That is, the outputs can be created with the resources available. And they also need to be relevant. The output will deliver the objectives. Finally, they need to be time-based. For example, that 100k saved each year will start from the next financial year. You will note I've not mentioned benefits here. That's because they're part of the business case. A benefit is similar to an outcome, but is specific to a person or group of people. As a project is time and cost bound, I'm sure you'll know about the project triangle and the dangers of scope creep. This section is used to define what is included and what is not included in a way that uncontrolled changes in scope cannot happen. Change in the project is inevitable as the project environment is never stable, but this section can ensure change can be controlled and the effect of change on cost, timing, quality, etc. can be fully considered before being approved. This section therefore requires some thought and consideration and needs to be written concisely and precisely, as being vague introduces the potential for scope creep. Every project is executed in an environment, and these will constrain what can and cannot be done. There are obviously constraints to the dimension of the project, such as time, costs, outputs, and quality, which are normally interdependent. There could also be other constraints due to the resources available and their skill levels. There could also be political, economic, social, and technological constraints. There may be constraints around sustainability and the environment, equality, diversity and inclusion, and safety, all of which would need to be documented in this section. The PID is never written in an environment where everything is known, and thus there have to be assumptions. Assumptions are things that are believed not to be a constraint. Every assumption, of course, could be wrong and thus carries a risk. Therefore, it needs to be included in the initial risk register in the business case and checked for validity throughout the project lifecycle. By definition, a project introduces a change, and so it follows that people will be affected. Not all of these people will benefit. For example, a new way of working could make people redundant. People are generally resistant to change, especially if they do not know what it will mean for them and they perceive a risk. All these people affected by the project and then change that it introduces are stakeholders. So in this section, the most important of these are identified either as individuals or groups, and the effect of them is also recorded and what their interest is. Some could be useful advocates for change, whereas others may resist or even actively try and sabotage the project. Stakeholders have different levels of power, and this needs to be taken into account. By listing the stakeholders in the PID, that listing can then be used to create a separate stakeholder analysis. And on the back of that, a separate communications plan. The stakeholder analysis and the comms plan are not included in the PID as they're more dynamic and need closer management. As I've said, projects exist in an environment, and thus there will always be interfaces and interdependencies. Some of these may have already been articulated in the constraints section, but they are set out here to be absolutely clear about what they are. They could be internal or external to the projects. They may also need to be added to the risk register, as they could be risks. We now move on from what is to be delivered by the project to how it will be delivered. And the first thing to be considered and documented is how the project will be structured. One of the two principles is managing stages. So here you would set out how many stages and what they are. Smaller projects only usually need 2 stages, which may well overlap, That is initiation, where you develop the PID, the plan, secure approval, finance and resources, and then delivery. If the project is part of a wider program, i.e. a group of linked projects, then that would be written here with a brief description of where it fits in the program. It only needs to be brief, and it can direct the reader to the program documentation for more detail. This section will also describe how many work streams there will be and how they will be managed. They may be chosen along organisational lines, or by function, or by processes. This section, the structure of the project itself, although closely related to and interdependent with the governance structure, is not the governance structure. That comes later in the PID. This section is used to set out how the structure will be used to deliver the outputs of the project. This may be any combination of internal resources, subcontracts, or commercial partners. This section is not a detailed resource plan, but is used to identify who is involved and in what way to deliver the project. When using external resources, there will also always be risks, and therefore these can be considered for inclusion in the risk register in the business case too. This section will link to the commercial section of the business case if resources require a procurement process or transfers of funds. At the end of the project, it will be closed down and the team disbanded. There will be outputs which need to be handed over to the operational staff, i.e. to business as usual. There are different ways to do this, and the chosen approach is described here. It may be that a pilot is run, with the project still live, and after successful completion, there's a full go live. Or it could be a phased approach is used. For example, different departments, functions, or sites could go live with a new system at different times. Sometimes only a big bang is the only option, where everything must go live at once. The choice will be constrained by what is being changed and the business as usual environment. The size of the change and the risks will also play a part, as will costs. A small low-risk change, for example, would not be piloted due to the additional cost of doing so, whereas a big complex change that has a high risk of problematical implementation would almost certainly have a pilot or an exhaustive testing period. We now turn to the business case. This section states why we are undertaking the project. Prince 2 states that it must be valid and remain valid throughout the project life cycle. The format is not a section of the PID. I'm just using this slide to explain my recommended format for this section, i.e. what subsections are used. So, as I said earlier, HM Treasury published best practice guidance on investment for public bodies to follow in a document called the Green Book. This has a section in it on business cases and recommends the 5-case model. In this model, you set out the 5 cases for change, which I'll describe in more detail on the following slides. They are the strategic change, the economic case, the commercial case, the financial case, and the management case. Sometimes the business case is a standalone document and is referenced in the PID. The PID may be shared with partners and customers, but the business case could contain commercially sensitive information. In this case, a basic business case may be included in the PID without that information, and a separate business case produced with the sensitive information in it for internal use only. We don't usually want to share what our margins are with our customers. So the first case is the strategic case. This is the section where the alignment of the reasons for undertaking the project to corporate, mission and vision, and policy and strategy are explained. Thus, places Thus, it places the project in the corporate context. For public bodies, it will also be here where alignment to government policy is demonstrated. This section is also used to describe the existing situation, the issue or problem to be resolved, or what the business need is. It will express the product or service need and what the spending objectives are. In this section, you would then go on to discuss the solution design, including what the options are, and to appraise those options and state the chosen option, with the rationale for making that choice. Finally, in this section, the degree of change is made clear. Is it a really big change or something relatively simple, or somewhere in between? It's important to keep this section succinct and not duplicate the background and the objectives from earlier in the PID. The second case is the economic case. This section starts with stating what evidence there is that implementing the change will have the desired impact. This cause and effect proof is something that is essential for gaining approval to proceed. The next part is proof of value. This is where the impact and outcomes are justified. It will hark back to the strategic context and show how the outcomes will address the need in a cost-efficient way. I've talked about outputs and outcomes. I'll now turn to the benefits. Outcomes are the changes that have been brought about, e.g. a new operating model is being used, but benefits are specific to people or groups of people. For example, a new operating model could save the organisation money, could mean customer lead times are shorter. Typical benefits are also reduced costs, improved specifications that benefit customers, etc. The final section of the economic case sets out these benefits. It will separate the cost benefits from other benefits. It will set out the investment both in capital and revenue terms and also any recurring costs in addition to the one-off costs. It will then set out the savings and calculate the benefits using accounting techniques such as payback period, return on investment, net present value, etc. Benefits can be described as cash releasing or non-cash releasing. In my experience, most are usually the latter, i.e. the savings are simply absorbed or reinvested, usually by way of increasing capacity to increase output. After the financial benefits or investment costs, if no savings, would come the non-financial benefits. These may be quantifiable or not. They can include things like customer satisfaction and staff satisfaction, which, although qualitative, can be quantified using surveys, for example. Finally, in this section, any disbenefits should be noted and quantified. The disbenefits should not outweigh the benefits, otherwise the business case is not valid and the project should not proceed. The economic benefits could be commercially sensitive, as I set out before, as it sets out the justification for the investment. It's also worth remembering not every project will save money. There may be other compelling reasons which could increase costs, for example, to comply with new legislation. This is the section that deals with the procurement aspects of the change being introduced. Many projects, but not all, will require procurement of equipment, consumables, IT hardware, software, etc. The procurement strategy will demonstrate that there are suppliers around who can actually provide what is needed. Sometimes there will be subcontractors who manage part of the project for you, as set out in the project approach, and this will be described in this section. The section will also describe how the suppliers are to be selected. The route chosen must follow procurement rules, both within the organisation and as set out in law. So if in doubt, seek advice from your procurement department. It could be done via a formal tendering process, or by way of an existing procurement agreement. It could also be by way of a single source waiver if of low value. Whatever it is to be is set out here with the justification of why that procurement route has been chosen. Finally, in this section, if any contracts are to be established, then the way they will be managed should be set out here. This will include who will manage them, the timing of any formal contract reviews, how any deviances are to be managed, and how performance will be managed, including how any penalties may be applied. The full contract will go into much more detail, but the basics are set out in this section. In some cases, it may be possible to simplify this section by referencing a standard contract used by the organisation. While the economic case deals with the justification, the financial case deals with the affordability. Thus, it will set out the total cost of ownership, building on the capital and revenue costs set out in the economic case to cost of change over the expected life cycle of the product or service. In the case of a product, expected warranty costs would be included in this section. The affordability of the project is set out, i.e., where's the money coming from and is there enough money, along with proof that there's financial sustainability over the life of the project. The final section of the business case part of the PID deals with resources. This will need to show the project management capacity and skills exist and are available. It may say which team they're coming from and a little about that team and the project management infrastructure to deliver, but not the project governance, which comes later. This section also deals with data governance and will set out in overarching terms what the IG strategy will be. For example, will a data protection impact assessment be required? Will data sharing agreements or data processing agreements be required? If intellectual property rights are generated by the project, then how this will be handled is also set out here, including how ownership will be determined. This can then be used to inform contracts when they're written, particularly important if you're using subcontractors. An initial risk assessment should be undertaken and the key risks listed in this section. Earlier sections have highlighted what may need to be included, for example, in the assumptions. The impact assessments are referenced here for quality and safety, for data privacy, for equality, and the environment. The actual assessments are usually added as appendices to the PID, but here a subsection on each should be included to say if there's any impact, and if so, is that impact positive or negative? If there are negative impacts, then the reason the project should still go ahead despite them needs to be justified here. The final section of the PID is project governance. This would normally start with an organisational diagram showing the reporting relationships. It's better here to use job roles rather than names so that the PID does not become out of date if people move on. The structure should also show how the project reports beyond its own boundaries, i.e. into a program or a portfolio or into the corporate management structure. It should also include the key roles in delivering the project from top to bottom, as shown on the slide. It is also possible to have a generic version available of these roles and responsibilities and team structures that you could just drop in. The roles and responsibilities should be defined for all the roles in the organisational diagram in the previous section. They should be written in generic terms so that they do not need to be altered should the project scope change. As a minimum, they should include the title, the main responsibilities, and the accountabilities, along with the levels of authority and the limits of authority need to be clear. Roles and responsibilities is another area where generic corporate or program descriptions can be used if they exist and are held in corporate files. For example, if they're in a SharePoint or intranet location, then this section may simply state that and provide the link. This is where the strategies for managing things like the risks, the issues, and the changes are set out. This is not where the registers and logs sit. It is the rules on how you will, for example, identify the risks, record them on the register, and then manage and mitigate them. The rules of configuration management or version control are also set out here. The quality management strategy is also included. This is not the actual quality plan for the project, it's the policy that describes how quality will be assured. Similarly, the stakeholder management strategy is not the list of stakeholders, which exists as a separate document. The strategy states how the stakeholders will be identified and categorized and how a communications plan will be used to inform them. Finally, the benefits management strategy will detail how benefits are to be identified and quantified, how risks to benefits will be managed, and how the realization of the benefits will be planned. All of these strategies may exist at a corporate or program level, and so this section could just be a series of references and links. The project control subsection is where the mechanisms are described about how progress to plan and cost to budget are monitored, along with managing the risks, issues and changes. Also, communications to stakeholders. That is how the strategies are applied in the project. The normal mechanisms are meetings and reports. Therefore, this section will describe which meetings are to be established, along with their terms of reference, to include attendees, frequency, authority levels, etc. Action logs are normally set up too for meetings. Reporting is usually by the way of highlight, exception and checkpoint reports, and so the content and frequency would be specified here. This is another area where there may be corporate policies or departmental standards that can be referenced. It's also possible to reference the PID of a portfolio or program that encompasses the project where these may already be set out. The final section of the project governance is the project plan. This is where the key milestones are set out with dates. They can be listed, and in particular the start and end dates of the delivery phase, along with any benefit review dates. If there are to be multiple stages, then these will be set out here. It would be normal to add a link to a project plan in this section, or a baseline project plan could be embedded. If the project is part of a wider program where planning is at that level, then that can be linked to instead. When considering embedding or linking to a project plan, the audience must be considered. Can they reach the location of the linked plan, i.e. do they have the right access rights, or do they have the right software to open an embedded plan? For these reasons, if a PID is to be read by external audiences, it may be worth embedding a PDF version along with the link for your internal audience. The plan, like a PID, is a living document. However, it's only when the scope changes enough to cause a PID update would an updated plan be required in the new version of the PID. You don't keep coming back to this PID and updating the plan section. If a link is used instead of embedding a file, it could be to a live plan, in which case a baseline should be applied to it that must match how the plan stood at the time the PID was approved. So in summary, the project initiation document does what it says on the tin. It's used to initiate a project. It needs to describe what the outputs, outcomes, and benefits of the project will deliver and why it's valid to deliver them. It will describe how they are to be delivered and how the delivery will be governed so that scope, change, quality, cost and timing are controlled. The PID is developed during initiation and used to gain approval, and once approved is frozen. Because projects are delivered over time and things change, both internal to the project and external to it, sometimes there are significant changes which, once approved, trigger an update to the PID. This PID update is approved and frozen too and sits alongside the original PID. All versions of the PID can then be used to assess success at the end of the project. Authorization of the PID is used to commit resources and move to delivery. Lessons learnt should be captured throughout the project, and especially when any revision to the PID is required. Any questions?
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. It's a fascinating presentation there. Now, just before we get to the questions, we've had quite a lot of questions actually asking about whether we make the slides available after the webinar, and I've been messaging people back, but I just thought it'd be appropriate to just say now is that we don't make the slides available. However, the webinar itself is available to watch again on demand, and you will get the link by email after the webinar ends in the next 24 hours. So please look out for that in your inbox if you do want to look again. But we don't make the slides available without reference to the speaker, etc. So we've got a couple of questions, and hopefully some more will start coming in as you're answering these, Dave. So I'll start with the first question, and this is coming: how best can one manage risk and return portfolio strategies in a project?
I mean, that's a whole nother webinar, really. Managing risk is something that the Project Controls TN has done several times in the past. We've had a previous webinar on the subject, which I believe unfortunately is no longer available to watch. We've also put on events where we've discussed that live with an audience. It's a huge subject, managing risks. To my mind, the key is to identify all of the risks. And because of the way that the PID is written, with the assumptions and the need maybe to use subcontractors and things like that, you do sort of flush out a lot of the more important risks. And so then you can get them into that initial risk register in the business case, which you can then obviously lift and drop into a live risk register where you would rate all your risks for probability of happening, impact if they happen, possibly proximity, how soon might it happen, and then you would look at what you can do to, if those risks do happen, what you can do to either mitigate them, so you could potentially do something in advance which would diminish the probability, or if they do happen, you could have a strategy which would actually mitigate the impact. But that's the way I would do it.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Question from another David now. Where do we download the Treasury documents from?
I haven't got the link to hand. If you just search HM Treasury Green Book on your favourite search engine, I'm sure you'll find it.
Okay, thanks. A question from Ganesh. Who will be the approving authority for PID?
It depends on the organisation itself. So you may have a project director if you're in a traditional Prince 2 sort of format. You may have a senior responsible officer. It's usually somebody working at an executive level. If you're being commissioned to do a project by another organisation, then that other organisation will probably want to approve it. So it's very situational. It really does depend on the nature of the project. I've tried to sort of cover all different types of projects here and be a bit agnostic, although you probably noticed that there are some NHS references in the slides because I originally produced this for an NHS audience where the customer was one of the people that did need to approve it. But yeah, it depends, I suppose, who's asked you to do the project. They will be the person that probably needs to approve it.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks. Just want to come back to the documents in the Treasury book you mentioned. Nicholas is asking, are there not any general books or publications that you would be able to recommend for the audience to look at?
No, I've not particularly seen. I mean, I've only really read the Prince 2 manual for the business case and these Treasury ideas. But I think I've sort of covered the main thrust of what you do in each of those 5 cases in the presentation. So, you know, as a succinct description of what's required, you could watch the presentation back. Obviously, the Treasury Green Book is huge because it's about investment as well as just the business case that supports the investment. So there's a lot there. But I'm not aware of any books.
Okay, great stuff. Moving on to the next question. This is coming from Hayden. How does the PID differ from a project charter?
Yeah, a project charter, and there's also things like a project mandate and a project brief. They tend to be the documents that kick off the PID. So it's, if you like, a document that gives the overall outline that then the PID goes into significantly more detail that that is used to ensure that the project is properly set up so you can measure your success at the end and you can justify what you're doing and get management to commit resources and money and give you the time to do the project. So a project charter is specifically more around agile project management, whereas a mandate and a project brief are more sort of Prince 2 documents.
Okay, interesting question now. So I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, but Mutada is asking, they're in an organisation that tends to run a number of smaller projects, perhaps 4 to 8 weeks, with much smaller budgets. At what size or complexity does it make sense to consider lightweight PIDs that skip some of the sections?
Yeah, certainly at that level, and I've worked at that level with a whole load of very small projects once back in my manufacturing days. I wouldn't recommend necessarily skipping many sections, but you could potentially make each section a single paragraph. You could really reduce it right down. But if you include all of the sections, then at least you know you're covering all the important information. What I've done in the past is, particularly for the strategies, for example, and project controls, things like that, I've written documents that you can then reference in your PID rather than sort of include them every time or have to reinvent the wheel every time. So if you're doing lots of projects, it's well worth having a project management methodology that's written into the strategies that you would follow for all of the projects.
Okay, a slightly related question from Kenny. What project value would you expect a PID to be required? So he's less than 1 million, 10 million?
I've done mini PIDs for sort of, £1,000, for example, because there had to be a business case in particular, because you had to get somebody to approve the spending. So the PID was more of a business case than anything else. So it really just depends on your own organisation and their own financial management as to would they need it to commit the resources. And it's always worth putting some sort of project definition together that says, this is what's going to come out at the other end of it, and justify that.
Okay, another related question, trying to group them all together for you. Chris is asking, what would be the size of a standard PID, and how would this compare to a large project PID going through government approvals, based on the Green Book guidance you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, the last PID that I wrote was about 20 pages long, and that did use the Green Book sections, and it was for a national program within the NHS. And it did have to have NHS England approval, so it did have a sort of level of government approval. I mean, that was then backed up by a contract that was well over 100 pages long, but they wrote that, thank goodness. So you should be able to do, for a medium-sized project, you should be able to do a 20-page PID. Obviously, if you're doing something like HS2, then it's going to be much, much bigger because it's got so much more to put in it. There's a lot more risk. It's over a longer period of time. There's a lot more unknowns. I mean, how you get the benefits out there, it's quite complex. So that would be probably hundreds of pages.
Okay, thanks. Moving on. Another David asks, is there a significant difference in a PID between Prince2 and Agile? And would you still recommend the Green Book 5-case method if using Agile?
I would say there is a difference, and I would still use the 5-case book, but you might sort of not put too much in each section because you still need to justify the investment. However, in the project definition, you would make a change, so you probably put what's to be delivered in using Moscow, so must have, should have, could have, won't have sort of criteria, because Agile has a sort of flexible scope. In the project approach, you would talk about the structure of how you're setting it up in an Agile way, so about things like sprints. You would specify maybe in broad brush terms how many sprints there might be, or maybe even groups of sprints to deliver different parts of the project. And in the sort of project governance, you would talk about maybe stand-ups, meetings and things like that. So you would flex your PID around the Agile approach, but you would still use most of the sections, I would have thought.
Okay, thanks. Question now from Mohammed. When stakeholders are in conflict or do not have enough details about the requirements, what is the best way as a project professional to collect the requirements?
I mean, this goes back to some of the things like house of quality and the techniques that are used for collecting the PID. I've seen a very funny cartoon which has got a sort of a tyre hung from a tree on a rope, and it's got various things like how it was specified, what the customer wanted, and a whole load of different things. And it's different in every picture and doesn't work in most of the pictures. It's a different subject, really. Is getting there's a name for it as well. Requirements gathering, I suppose. It's something that requires a separate set of skills, really, from project management, I think. And it's not my area of expertise.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Moving on to the next question. Stephen asks, you discussed having a separate commercially sensitive business case. If this was required, how much info would you put in the PID?
So I have done this, and the PID had most of the information that was in the commercially sensitive version. It's just that in the commercially sensitive version, we went and put the actual cost of delivering the project in for the cost of the team that was going to deliver it. So there was numbers there about um, people, not necessarily people's rates because we used blended rates, but costs about how much people, and then obviously there was a price to deliver this project that we were paid, and I hope nobody's registered from NHS England, but we then worked out that we got a margin there based on the cost of delivering the project over the period of a year that we needed to do so, which then paid for the contribution that was required in the company. That was the organisation I was working with. So it's really that return on investment section that is the bit that you leave out of the PID that you show to others, but put in the PID that somebody's going to have to say, oh yes, there is a return on investment, so yes, I will commit the resources from within your own organisation.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question now from someone who is a professional in the NHS. He's asking about, are there webinars that cover each section in more detail? So specifically, we've not done any from the IET, from the Project Controls Network, that covers the sections of a PID. But I don't know, Dave, if you just wanted to comment, because I know that you have delivered or have been involved in lots of webinars previously. So.
I never managed to deliver this presentation while I was still working in the NHS, but there is in the NHS an innovation collaborative for digital health, and within that innovation collaborative for digital health, which is on the NHS Futures website, there are presentations particularly around using the Green Book in healthcare. So he's left now, but Bradley Quinn, who worked for Health Innovation Manchester, did 3 or 4 presentations on using the Green Book to produce a business case. Now, they were specifically around remote monitoring, but I think the detail is quite transferable to other types of projects. So it might be worth, if the NHS person is registered on NHS Futures, to ask for access to the Innovation Collaborative for Digital Health and then go and search out those presentations. There's recordings there and the slides are there.
Okay, thanks. We are fast approaching the hour, so there's about 3 or 4 quick questions, hopefully, that we'll try and get to. So Adil is asking, is it appropriate to refer to PID as a business report?
Well, it's not a business as usual business report. It is specific to the project, and therefore I wouldn't normally refer to it as a business report. It's a project. I just call it a project initiation document with a business case.
Okay. Is a PID the same as a feasibility study?
That's a good question. Yes and no. Obviously, you need to do a feasibility study to ensure some of the sections of the PID require some of that information. So usually you'd do a feasibility study first, and they cost resources, they cost money and people, so you'd need to maybe do that off the back of a project brief or something, because the proof of value bit and the proof that it will deliver the impact required would come from a feasibility study. Therefore, I think a feasibility study sort of comes first, but they could overlap quite easily.
Okay, quick one. What level of Prince 2 course attended is needed to write a PID?
I mean, I did the practitioner's exam, and I think that would probably be suitable. But it's you don't have to be Prince 2 qualified to write a good PID if you follow the basic principles that I've set out. But so, and potentially a foundation person would probably have enough of a background to do it. It's more about applying that methodology and having an inquiring mind and making sure everything is set up to be able to initiate the project, to gain approval to spend the money, and also to be able to measure success at the end of the project.
Okay, 2 more quick questions. So, now, forgive my ignorance if I get this wrong, but someone's saying, I'm practicing the PMBOK framework. Does that mean anything? Am I saying that right? Is there any conflict with Prince 2?
I've heard of the PMOBK or BOK or whatever it is. I think I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is, so I couldn't answer the question. Right. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. So, one more quick question, please, if we may. How would you scale a PID for different projects in terms of amount of work, number of people involved, the cost, the length of time required, and the level of risk?
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly how you scale the PID, is the level of risk, the size of the project, the cost of in terms of people involved and the costs, and the length of time. So obviously, the longer the project, the more people involved, the higher the cost, or the higher the risk, then the more detailed and the longer the PID would need to be. So for short, quick business investments that you maybe deliver in 6 months, that cost a few £1,000, you could do a very, very short PID. If you deliver an HS2, it'd be massive. And it's really about understanding the sort of the business and the business need, and scaling it to suit. And you will get guidance. Obviously, somebody somewhere has got to approve the spending and approve the PID, so you can get guidance from that person as to what they want to see in the PID.
Okay, just for clarification, someone's just popped on in the question box. So PMBOK is a project management body of knowledge, and it's currently
that's
APM.
APM. So I knew I'd heard of it.
Yeah,
it's APM.
That's right.
The body of knowledge is significantly deeper than Prince 2. Prince 2 is just one facet of the body of knowledge. The body of knowledge goes into risk management, issue management, change management, and into quite a lot of detail. So the body of knowledge is far superior, if you like, to just the Prince 2 method. I'd always refer to the body of knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that for us, Jonathan. Appreciate that. So, okay, we're coming up to the end of the hour now, so I do need to close. I just wanted to answer one question live. Someone asked about the CPD certificate and can we make it available sooner. If you've reached this far with us, you should be able to download your certificate now whilst the webinar is still going on. It's the end of the webinar, so if you click on the button at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to download your certificate. So thanks again to you, David. It's been a great presentation, some really great questions there. I think we managed to get through most of them. There may be a couple that I need to follow up with you afterwards, if that's okay.
Yeah,
thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you found this worthwhile. I do ask if you please give us your feedback via the survey link afterwards, because this really does help the network when we start to plan future events and webinars. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, you will get a link via email to the recorded on-demand webinar if you want to watch again. So yeah, thanks again to everyone. It's been my pleasure to host this webinar, and take care and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.